Clinical treatment means redirecting a patient's physiological trajectory, but treatment is not always possible. The patient must have physiological reserve to be redirected. When organ function is already at the failure boundary, there is no reserve left. The intervention has no margin to work with. This is not a failure of clinical strategy. It is a structural condition that eliminates the possibility of effective treatment. A patient moves through a space of physiological states over time. Some states are transient. The patient can recover from them. Some states are absorbing. Once entered, irreversible organ failure has occurred. The absorbing set is the clinical failure region. Clinical management is about steering the patient away from that region. But this requires that the patient currently have sufficient physiological reserve. Proximity to the failure boundary constrains what treatment can achieve. The feasible treatment set contains physiological states where intervention is still effective. At the boundary of this set, the patient is at the edge of irreversible failure. The boundary is not a safety zone. It is the last position before clinical absorption. Inside the feasible set, physiological reserve is positive. On the boundary, reserve reaches zero. The transition from interior to boundary is the critical clinical threshold. Crossing it eliminates treatability. Physiological reserve is the distance from the patient's current state to the irreversible failure boundary. It is a quantity, not a clinical strategy. Clinicians cannot create reserve through protocol alone. They can only consume it or preserve it. Reserve is consumed when physiology drifts toward the failure region. It is preserved when the patient is steered away from that boundary. The minimum viable reserve is determined by organ dynamics, not by the treatment team. A clinical protocol modifies the transition probabilities of the patient's physiological trajectory. It can reduce the probability of moving toward irreversible failure on any given step, but the protocol is effective only when the patient has positive physiological reserve. As reserve approaches zero, the ability to alter the trajectory vanishes. At zero reserve, any physiological transition leads to organ failure with certainty. No clinical protocol can redirect a patient who has already reached the absorbing failure boundary. The treatment space collapses to the empty set. In acute liver failure, remaining hepatocyte mass is the physiological reserve. When functional mass reaches the critical threshold, no treatment can restore synthetic function. The absorbing state is irreversible failure, and it is permanent. In septic shock, the reserve is the remaining hemodynamic response capacity. When vasopressor requirements exceed maximal organ tolerance, circulatory collapse is certain. Physiological reserve is a structural property, not a policy choice. Maintaining distance from the failure boundary is the only structural protection available. No increase in treatment intensity removes the structural constraint when reserve is zero.